Hi, I'm David Wood, and this is Wood on Words, a podcast devoted to everything related to writing and publishing. A little bit about me: I'm primarily an action adventure author, best known for the Dane Manic Adventure series. I also write a little bit of fantasy under a pen name, and I do a lot of work with co-authors as my series and universe have expanded. I operate a small press called Griffinwood, and I co-host a podcast called Authorcast. Now, I've chosen to do this podcast for a few reasons. First of all is that, like a lot of writers, I get a lot of people asking me for advice, mostly on how to get published, how to get started in independent publishing, how to seek an agent or seek publication in the traditional realm. And I find that those conversations all always go the same way. We usually schedule a call if it's someone I know well, and I wind up telling them each person all the same things. And often they are things they could read up on. And then I feel like if I could introduce them to all these basic things, give them some resources in one place, then if they still wanted to ask me questions, we could be more productive. They could get into the real meat of things, get my advice with things they really need help with, and we wouldn't be investing hours a session just talking about the basics. So I'm creating this podcast along with, I'm going to do companion YouTube videos and posts on my website and the Wood on Words blog as a resource to anyone who's getting started, who wants those beginning questions answered, and who wants to maybe ask for my advice on a lot of things. I think that if I can point people there first, that'll save us all a lot of time, and hopefully those resources will be there all the time so people can take a look at them. The second is prompted by a workshop that I recently did called the Indie Publishing Success Workshop. Through my podcast, through my website, through personal relationships, I've been giving advice for some time in different ways. And also, I'm fortunate enough to be involved in some private Facebook groups with some very successful authors, particularly independent published or hybrid authors who are publishing both independently and traditionally. And so I'm always looking to pick up new tips and tricks and things like that. And so I distilled them into a workshop that I presented at Balticon recently. It's a sci-fi fantasy con in Baltimore, Maryland. And a couple things happened. First of all, I had way too much material for the time that was allotted. And I wound up putting the PowerPoint outline up on my website, but I realized that there's just so much that I had to share that even if I had made it through my entire presentation, I wouldn't have gotten all that material out in a reasonable amount of time. There was really a lot of material to put together. And so the people who attended the workshop, we had a big crowd. They were all very excited about it. And a lot of people have been suggesting that I do a podcast and do a video and put some online resources up there. So that's what I'm going to do. One of the things we'll be doing is walking through the steps of my Indie Publishing Success Workshop. And this will be distilling not just things that have worked for me, but that have worked for people who are a lot more successful than I am. And it's possible if you're listening to this podcast down the road, some things will change, but I'll put out new episodes and update things as I learn them. And I'll also share as I try new things. And so hopefully we'll succeed and fail together. And the other reason I'm doing this is that podcasts have had such an impact on me as a writer. Early on, when I was just working on books and stories and submitting to markets, participating in writing workshops, podcasts kept me going. I got great advice from them. I learned about the craft. I learned about the market. And I just felt encouraged by them. Someone like Mur Lafferty with the I Should Be Writing podcast, I remember sort of feeling like I was on that journey with her, and it felt like a success to all her listeners when she got her first traditional publishing deal. My friend Joanna Penn has a wonderful Creative Pen podcast. She gives so much to the writing community. And guys like the Self-Publishing podcast, Writing Excuses, so many great podcasts. So this is an opportunity for me to give what I can, and in a format that I love, because I love podcasting. So for today's topic, I want to begin at what I consider the very beginning, and that is the craft of writing. Now, I find myself in a position quite often where people come to me and say, I'm ready to get published. What do I do? And what they're wanting to know is Can you help me reach an editor? How can I find an agent? Or what are the bells and whistles or what are the steps of self-publishing? But what I find more often than not is that they haven't done the most basic thing, which is really develop their skills as a writer. And it's not that writers, some people are just arrogant or unrealistic about their skills, but for the most part, there's this paradox. I think it's called Menno's paradox. I think that's how you pronounce it. And basically, in a nutshell, it means that you can't know what you don't know. So it could be that someone believes their writing is perfectly good because they're unaware of the conventions of the craft of writing, of the things that they're expected to do in a manuscript. And consequently, they can't evaluate their own writing accurately. None of us can because they don't have that knowledge there. In my case, from the earliest age, people told me what a great writer I was. I suspect it's because growing up in school, I was the only one who actually liked writing, or one of the very few. Kids, it seems like, don't love to write. Many of them don't even love to read. I loved both. So yeah, by comparison to kids in my classes, I probably was a very good writer. And in high school and then in college, I could write a very good essay. I was on the debate team in high school, so I learned about critical thinking skills and analytical thoughts and how to build an argument and how to rebut an argument and how to communicate clearly. And I have pretty good vocabulary from having read all my life. And so by those standards, yes, I was a good writer. But that didn't mean that I could write fiction. And yes, on occasion we would write stories in school, but there again I would get good feedback mostly because I knew how to punctuate, how to spell, how to use good grammar, and I actually put effort into it, whereas other students really wouldn't. So when I finally got over my insecurities and fears and finally tried writing fiction for real, thankfully I joined a writer's workshop. At that point, I had shown some sample chapters to my wife, and she said she really liked them, but she wasn't going to do or say anything that would discourage me because she knew how long I'd wanted to be a writer. So she wasn't going to give me harsh critique. And thankfully, I found a writer's workshop. I went to sff.onlinewritingworkshop.com. And the way that workshop operates is, at least at the time, and I don't think this has changed, you would post sample chapters, and people would critique them. After you post your first few samples, you had to earn points that allow you to post more chapters, and the way you do that is by critiquing other writers' work. And so ideally, you learn from the critiques that they give. You learn from giving critiques. And that workshop also had just an abundance of articles on the basic crafts of writing and more advanced things. And that way, if somebody made certain comments that you didn't understand, you could look up what this thing is they're talking about, how to fix them. And I remember when I posted those first 3 chapters, on the one hand, I was very, very apprehensive, very nervous because, when you put out your writing, that you're vulnerable. And I felt that was probably one of the deepest exposures I could make of who I am and what I value. Putting my words out there was very scary. But if I was honest with myself, deep down, I expected that I was going to get the same kind of feedback that I always got in regard to my writing, which is, oh, this is awesome. You're great. You're fantastic. Well, I didn't. Now, some people did say they were interested in the story. They were interested in the characters. They had some positive things to say, but there were so many things wrong with my writing that I didn't even know existed. I had no idea that they were even rules. Off the top of my head, and this has been many years, but the idea of maintaining a consistent third-person point of view. I didn't know the difference between third person and omniscient, at least in terms of maintaining that point of view. I knew the difference between first and third, but I didn't know what head hopping was. I didn't know the difference between showing and telling. I didn't know what an info dump was, or an as you know, Bob. I didn't know that excessive adverbs were a bad thing. I didn't know it was a bad thing to use dialogue tags other than simple ones like said, and I didn't know that it was even better to avoid using them altogether. And those are just the few things that I'm remembering, like I said, right off the top of my head. But it was a shock to the system. And like a lot of people, I just kind of sat and pouted for a little while. And then I said, okay, well, let me figure out this one thing. And I looked it up and I started reading. And I was like, I can do that. And then I went along to another. And little by little, I got better. I learned how not to break those rules. So I improved my chapters. I reposted them. And people found new things that were wrong. But the other cool thing is, as I learned those lessons were reinforced by me critiquing other people's work and looking for the kind of mistakes that I was making myself. And also, I could read someone's work and identify something I didn't like. And as I figured out how to express that, that would sometimes reveal problems in my own work. So being a part of that writing workshop made a big difference. Because if self-publishing as it exists today had been an option back then, I would have put out an utter piece of crap manuscript. And you don't want to do that. And I see people doing it a lot nowadays. One of the problems I have, one of the things that's difficult for me, is that I was a teacher for a long time. So I was a language arts teacher, encouraged writing with my students. We did a lot of reading. I read aloud every day in class, tried to introduce them to popular fiction. It was an amazing experience. I loved teaching, probably wouldn't have quit it for anything other than full-time writing. And one of the great things is some of my students have gone on to write books. But it's always difficult to me when a 13, 14, 16-year-old comes to you and says, okay, I've finished writing my book, had it proofed for typos and punctuation and grammar. How do I get it published? And that's so difficult for me because, first of all, I never, ever want to shoot down someone who wants to be an author. There can't be enough authors in the world, in my opinion. There can't be enough books and stories told out there. Storytelling is just essential to life. It's something that I love, even from the days when I was little and my grandfather would tell stories from his upbringing in Appalachia. So I never want to make somebody give up. But at the same time, there's no way that manuscript is ready. And frankly, if it's the first book you wrote, or honestly, unless you're a special snowflake, a book that you wrote as a kid probably doesn't have the maturity of voice. It's probably not where it needs to be. But in any case, as arrogant as that sounds, it's probably the truth. It's very rare that our early works, really when you're writing at any age, are going to be of the quality they need to be. And so obviously the best advice to give that person is to say, get some critiques on this, find out what's good and what's bad, and then write another book and make it better. And then do it again. I remember years ago, back when I was first tinkering with my story, I'd been in the writer's workshop for about 6 months. I was moving forward slowly. I read an interview with one of my favorite authors, David Eddings, a fantasy author who passed away a few years ago. And he gave some advice, which is actually, now I realize, pretty common. And that is that if you want to be a professional writer, write the million best words you can write. Make them the absolute best you can be. Shed your blood, sweat, and tears. Do everything you can, and then throw them away. Now you're ready to be a writer. And that discouraged the hell out of me at the time because, like a lot of writers, I had had some starts and stops and thrown some things away. I had written some stories that I knew weren't very good. I had written some novel starts. I had done a lot of work. I generated a lot of words that were never going to see the light of day, but I certainly hadn't written a million. And I was so attached to the book that I was writing. And I think that's normal for everybody. Our first one that we take to completion, most of us at the time are deeply in love with it. It's like your first girlfriend or first boyfriend or something, and you think that you're going to be in love with it forever. And if this doesn't work, I'll never write another book again. This one has to see publication. And some people keep revising and keep working and keep submitting that same freaking book over and over. And it's the biggest mistake in the world. And I remember reading that advice and wanting to give up. And thankfully I didn't. And now I can look back and I can see the wisdom of that advice. Now, 1 million words is arbitrary. You probably don't have to write 1 million. But there's a as I said, a maturity to your writing that comes over time, comes with experience, comes with taking chances, seeing what works and what doesn't, getting critical feedback, that you're not going to have at the outset. And frankly, your first attempts at writing are probably going to be so flawed that you can't take that first book and rework it into something great. It's going to be more effective to take your lessons learned and produce a new book. Now, some of my first early works did see the light of day, and I frankly sold a lot of copies, but they weren't my very first works. And I certainly didn't put them out before I had learned a lot of valuable lessons and gotten a lot of feedback. Another thing that I see, and this is a big problem with how easy it is now to self-publish, and I am not one of those people who thinks it's a bad thing. I firmly believe that there are, frankly, a lot of quality stories out there, more quality stories than there were slots in traditional publishing houses back in the day. And so that's fantastic. And frankly, I believe that readers should be the ultimate judges of what is worthy of publication. And things like Kindle and other forms of digital publishing, print on demand, audiobooks, those are great ways to put your stories out there. But the problem that has arisen is it's so easy that you're seeing some really bad books out there. For the most part, it's sort of like the tree falling in the forest when no one's there to hear it. I don't think that they're really clogging up Amazon. Nobody even knows these books exist. But I have seen some people who get off to a nice start. They've got a snappy cover that works for their genre, got a good product description, they do a little advertising, they make connections, and their book starts selling. But then when you look at the sample, it's bad. It's difficult to talk about this without, I don't want to come across like I'm talking about anyone in particular, though I could. But let's be real, I'm not saying I'm a literary genius either. I write light, pulpy action adventures. Sometimes I and my editors miss things, make mistakes, but I do try to get better, and I think I'm writing pretty decent product that people like to read. But anyway, I know writers who have started off okay, and then things start going downhill because the bottom line is they didn't learn their craft. And some readers have low expectations. Thankfully for me, that's why I sell books. And some of them aren't all that discerning, but they can tell a difference. And if you haven't learned your craft up to a reasonable professional standard, it's going to hurt you in the long run. You might get out of the gate fast, but you're going to go downhill. And, say what you will about all the bad traditionally published books people have read. The reality is those are still better than the bad indie books. I believe that the best indie writers, well, I know for a fact that some of them are the same people. So there are some people who are having great indie success and also being successful in traditional publishing. They're hiring a lot of the same freelance editors that some publishing houses use. They're putting out quality product, but if you're taking the median of each, at least the traditionally published book has had content editing as well as line editing. It's gone through many rounds. It's going to be, on average, a much better product. So for an indie, you've got to work that much harder. And so I see people screwing up their careers at the outset by making a lot of mistakes when they're just not ready. And sometimes they even, if they publish under their own name, they kind of poison the well. I know some people who their works or their sales are just down to nothing. And even putting out new lines, new series, things like that, if they're using their own name, a lot of people are going to see that name on the cover, think, I tried that writer and I didn't like them. That's a terrible place to be in. And so I strongly advise that you work on your craft to begin with. And so here are the first bits of advice that I give to everybody when they're starting off. First is learn the basic rules of writing. And you can do this, get Strunk and White, read through that. There are all kinds of books on writing that can give you the basic introductory advice, your basic rules for craft. You can find them in the public library. You can find them in your bookstore, online. There are lots of great blogs and articles, and there are great podcasts that give you advice on writing. And, I'm not even going to list all of those because they're just that easy to find. And I'm of the belief that whether you want to be traditionally published or independently published, you got to have a good work ethic. So if you're not really willing to even look up articles on the craft of writing, search out some podcasts. I might put up some links, but basically go find them. But find these and learn the basics. Now, caveat, rules of writing can be broken, but it's important that you know them and are well versed in them first, and that you then break them by design. So that's number one, learn your basic rules of writing. The second is to join a writing workshop. I mentioned sff.onlinewritingworkshop.com and how that worked. Critters is another one I've heard of. I searched around at the time and I supplemented Online Writing Workshop. As I got interested in adventure, I found an online adventure writers group. I'm still friends with a couple of those authors. Some of them have gone on to different levels of success, which is a lot of fun to stay with those authors as we move forward in our careers. But it's a great way to get a lot of feedback. Now, some people like to get involved in local writing groups. They might find one through their public library, through the bookstore, might find them online, through Facebook. There are a lot of writing groups. Those can be great ways to make friendships. There's a few issues with those, though. First of all, unless that group is cycling new blood in and out, the kind of feedback you're going to get is eventually going to be limited. Everybody, again, we only know what we know. And you're going to find that if you're getting critiqued by the same people all the time, you're going to get the same kind of feedback all the time. And with an online writing workshop, you can get a much wider variety of critique and feedback, and hopefully you can reach out to writers at different levels. So find a writing workshop of some sort that's going to get you a nice variety of critique partners. The third thing is to find alpha and beta readers who either read or write in the genre in which you are writing. And alphas are the very first people who read your manuscript. Sometimes they're looking at your very first crappy draft or maybe your second draft, and they're going to give you feedback. And then the beta readers, after you've taken that alpha feedback, beta reader's going to read it when you think it's pretty close to going to an editor or pretty close to publication. They're going to give you more feedback. The thing that sets them apart from the writing workshop is they might not be teaching you so much about mechanics. It depends on the reader, of course. But ideally, these are people who know your genre well. And realistically, if you're looking to be commercially successful, you need to know your genre, and you need to write the kind of things readers in your genre want to read. And that leads me into number 4, which is read the current popular books in your genre. Now, if you're just writing for the art of it, you want to do creative things, you want to experiment, you want to write literary, maybe you want to write what you write, put it up online for people to read, you don't care if you make money, those are perfectly valid choices. There's nothing wrong with that. But for the sake of this podcast, I'm going to assume that we're interested in some degree of commercial success. And the reality is that while writing is a craft, it's an art, ultimately the books that we create are products that are up for sale. We need to know our market, and we should give the market what it wants. That's my belief. Some people will disagree with me. Some people might break the mold and do something very different, achieve some success. If you do, I'd love to hear from you, because I like seeing anybody succeed, frankly. But your best bet, your most effective strategy is to, like I said, know your genre, know your market, write what they want to write. And that means knowing what's successful, not just in your genre, but right now in your genre. I write thrillers and action adventures, fast-paced, pulpy things. Now, Doc Savage was a great inspiration for me. But the writing conventions that were acceptable back then are not what readers are looking for now. Now, there are some people who still love those old things. I still like reading them. But I can't write exactly Doc Savage and have it be successful today with a wide audience. My audience is going to be very narrow if I'm writing with that kind of craft. Now, I am working on a series. I got one book out called Arena of Souls that is sort of how do you pronounce it? Is it homage or homage? I don't know. Tribute to Doc Savage. But even then, I applied a lot of modern conventions to it. I wrote it to today's market with the subject matter and setting of a Doc Savage story. Even some of the more recent thrillers. I recently listened to an audiobook. It was a thriller that Michael Crichton wrote in the early 70s. Something Descend. It's not gonna come to me now. He wrote it under a pen name, and although it was short, and I figured it would be a fast, pulpy read, it really wasn't. It was very slow-paced. It had almost no action. It was fine for the time period, but if all I was reading were men's adventures from the 70s, There again, I'd be limiting my audience because I'm not writing what the average mainstream reader wants to read right now. So read current books in your genre. Likewise, if all I'm doing is rereading Harry Potter every year, those are great books. I can learn some lessons from Rowling. But it's not going to necessarily, I might craft better characters, have some better dialogue, learn to turn a nice sentence here and there, turn a nice phrase. But I'm not going to learn about how to write a current mainstream popular thriller. And that goes the same for any of my favorites. If I'm rereading Count of Monte Cristo every year and Lord of the Rings every year, that's not going to make me a better writer for today's market. And I assure you, the average reader is not looking for you to do some kind of mashup or to apply the conventions you learned from a book Tolkien wrote decades ago in a different genre and put it into today's contemporary thriller market, for example. So knowing what people want to read right now is important to your craft, because then you're going to be writing what they want to do, what they want to read. The fifth point is not only read, but read critically. Now, you remember how I said that even though I had been a voracious reader, that I had been considered a good writer all my life, I didn't know jack about writing fiction when I started, and you would think that having read so many books, including many books in the genre in which I was trying to write, that I would have known these things. And yes, you can inductively learn certain things, but it's that same old paradox. I didn't know what I didn't know, so I wasn't watching for things. So I remember years ago on the Dragon Page podcast, which was one of my all-time favorites, author Michael Stackpole said that he suggests you read a book twice. And it doesn't even have to be just the books you like. It could be ones you don't like. Go ahead and read it for fun. And I tell you, the deeper you get into writing, you might find yourself having a harder time immersing yourself in the reading process. You might not enjoy books as much as you did because it's hard to turn off that critical brain. But try to read it the first time just for pleasure reading like you've always done. And then go back over it analytically. Look at the way the author structured the plots and the subplots. Look for the literary devices, foreshadowing, symbolism, stuff like that. Look at how they develop characters. Look at simple things like the length of sentences on the page, the word choices, and how the author works at a sentence level to impact the mood or reflect the mood or the pacing of a certain sentence. Look at how the author generates emotion. Ask yourself what you loved about this book and what was it the author did that made you love it. And conversely, if you didn't like the book, what could the author have done differently? So 2 passes over the book. Another thing I like to do that's super easy now that I'm reading on an iPad digitally is, again, to learn on the sentence level. When I come across a really nicely crafted sentence, a nicely turned phrase, a word that I just love, I'll highlight it. And then when the book's over, I can scroll back through and copy those over into a notebook. And, I'm not necessarily going to lift those exact sentences, but I can learn from what the author did. I can improve my vocabulary. And you get the added bonus of by recopying it, it affects your brain. You learn it better when you rewrite something by hand. So that's another way to read critically. But not only reading in your genre, but read with the intention of learning. And this way, some of the best authors out there can become your teachers. And then the last bit of advice is to always be trying to improve. I think in video games, they talk about leveling up. We all are in danger of hitting a plateau. Ideally, especially if you're with a traditional publishing house, you hopefully will be working with great editors all the time who are always going to challenge you to become better, although that's not always necessarily the case. But typically, you're going to get good critique and really challenged in traditional publishing. But as an indie, it's super easy to hit a certain level and stay there. Maybe we've gotten comfortable with a certain editor. We've got the same old beta readers, and pretty soon we're making mistakes that we aren't aware of because we haven't improved. And so you're going to outgrow your critique partners sometimes. It doesn't mean you get rid of them. They can still catch those basic mistakes that they've been catching for you all along, but reach out and look for new and better people to critique you. Sometimes, the working writer isn't going to have a lot of time to critique you, but you might occasionally get somebody. Maybe you've exchanged favors. I've been able to build some relationships and help people out so that in turn, on occasion, I've been very fortunate that a successful writer in my genre has read over a manuscript and given me some advice that I've learned a great deal from. If you're an indie, hopefully as you become more successful, you can seek out, better content editors, better quality, or just different editors who can, there again, challenge you, teach you new things, take your writing to the next level. And, as this podcast goes on, we'll talk about networking, we'll talk about finding new editors, but always look for opportunities to get better. In my case, I'm very clear. I'm writing light, pulpy, fun stories, but I do try to get better. I try not to make the same mistakes over and over. I try new things, try to improve. So that's my very first advice. In summary, just, think about your craft. Don't publish too soon. Don't publish the first story you spit out. Try to be the best you can, and then keep trying to get better. So that's it for our first episode. I hope it was worthwhile. Hope you had a good time. I would love to hear your feedback. Feel free to comment on the site. I'll be happy if you want to ask questions, if you want to challenge or argue with me. I'll be happy to read those on a future episode of the podcast. So I hope you'll visit me at woodonwords.com. That's going to be the central site for this podcast and for anything I'm doing that isn't about me selling my fiction. On there, I'm giving away a free audiobook. My novella Primitive is up there. You can get it off my YouTube channel. I also, whenever I have articles about the craft of writing or the business, little blog posts, I've transferred some old ones over there already. Going to be book reviews there. Anything that comes to do with building relationships with writers, the craft, the business, or just giving you free stuff. So I hope you'll visit that site regularly. And if you want to check out things about me and my writing, visit me at davidwoodweb.com or listen to my other podcast, Authorcast. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.